Okay, good evening, everybody. I think we should begin because this is live stream, so we don't want to keep the people not physically present waiting too long. It's lovely to see you all here. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Alison Scott Bowman. I'm a professor here at SOAS. Very proud to welcome you all here for this very important evening. This is the second of three, which Nina will tell you a little bit more about. Just very quickly to give you the background to why we're all here today. Apart from the Assange case, this has been made possible because of a small research project I run called, wait for it, it sounds really cheesy, Influencing the Corridors of Power, ICOP, SOAS ICOP. We work directly with Parliament, we send briefings, we influence questions to ministers through MPs, we influence early day motions. We've learnt a lot together, a small team of part-time dedicated workers. We've learnt a lot over the last 2 years about democratic processes, which are actually there if you look and dig. So it's because of that that we're here tonight. We sent with Deepa, wrote a briefing for us, which went out recently to all MPs and all peers. Sometimes there's a deadly silence, but sometimes we do bite home. And in fact, my last comment to you, because I want to get on with the main business, obviously, is that today in the House of Lords, Claire Fox, now Baroness Fox of Buckley, quoted our work. She read out from one of our briefings about the policing bill. So it's worth trying to be heard in the corridors of power. And it's lovely to have you here this evening. Thank you. Nina. Where's she gone? She gone.
I'm back. Thank you, Alison, and thank you all for being here at SOAS this evening. To our online audience, just to let you know, you can use the hashtag ICOPJourno to submit questions or join in the discussion. And YouTube viewers can use the chat feature to submit questions. And we'll try to answer some of them at the end of the discussion. As Professor Alison said, this is the second event in our Journalism in the Firing Line series. The reason I thought we should focus on the case of Julian Assange today is partly because I followed and reported on Wikileaks revelations as part of my work in journalism. And as I was doing so, I couldn't help but think to myself that somebody's going to get into big trouble for this, because that's what tends to happen when you become inconvenient to powerful people. John Rees, our host, will talk more about this with our panellists in just a moment. First, we'd like to show you a video clip which really hits home why today's topic is so important. And just a warning that some of you may find the content disturbing. So just give us one moment. Sorry, just a slight technical issue. Okay, just a second. The lights.
There, 1 o'clock. Haven't seen anything since then.
Just fucking, once you get on, just open off.
Yeah, Roger. I see your element. You got about 4 Humvees out along this.
You're clear.
All right, firing. Line here. What space line? Let me know when you see it.
Won't you? Light them all up.
202 traffic, 260.
Come on, fire. Hey, Roger.
Keep shooting. Keep
removal. We got
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I was on.
bypass.
God damn it, Kyle. Sorry. I hit it by accident.
Roger, we got the
Okay. Come on, buddy.
All I gotta do is pick up a weapon.
Crazy Horse, this is Bushmaster 5, or Bushmaster 4, break. We are right below you, right time now. Can you walk us onto that location, over?
Now, Bushmaster, we have a van that's approaching and picking up the bodies.
Where's that van at?
Right down there by the body.
Okay, yeah.
Bushmaster, Crazy Horse, we have individuals going to the scene, looks like possibly picking up bodies and weapons.
Let me engage.
Hey, we need to stop that so we can get down there. We
Hey,
need to
shoot.
straight south. You see my location?
Roger. Break. Crazy Horse 1-8, request permission to engage individual. Picking up the wounded.
Yeah, we're trying to get permission to engage. Come on, let us shoot.
Bushmaster, Crazy Horse 1-8.
We're taking him.
Bushmaster, Crazy Horse 1-8.
This is Bushmaster 7, go ahead.
Roger, we have a black SUV or bongo truck picking up the bodies. Request permission to engage.
Bushmaster 7, Roger. This is Bushmaster 7, Roger, engage.
1-8, engage. Clear.
Come on.
Clear. Clear.
We're engaged.
Coming around, clear.
Roger. Trying to,
Aggressive 20, Commando 89ers active. Port arrival 311.
20.
Magnet radio, aggressive 3-4 is off zone 208 for zone 1. Call for exchange.
Aggressive 4-3, zone. Correction. Aggressive 3-4, zone 30 is closed. Report for exchange, zone 1.
Aggressive 3-4, welcome.
Roger. Roger, that's a negative on evac and the two civilian kids to Rusty. They're going to have the IPs link up with us over here, break. IPs will take them up to a local hospital, over. That's your copy, over. Roger that. White to tell.
Oh, it's their fault for bringing their kids to a battle.
That's right.
Okay, we're going to just take 2 minutes just to arrange the tables. If you could just bear with us for a second, then I'm going to introduce our host, John, and the other panellists. Going to have to push Stella as well. Okay, sorry about that. So I'm just going to quickly introduce John Rees, our host, who's going to talk more about what we just saw with our panellists in just a moment. John Rees is a writer, a campaigner, and a broadcaster. He's a visiting research fellow at Goldsmiths, University of London, a co-founder of Stop the War Coalition, and a lifelong member of the NUJ. He's currently the national coordinator of the Don't Extradite Assange campaign. Welcome, John.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much, Nina, and to Alison for arranging this very important discussion, I believe. And I think it's important because no matter how many times you watch the so-called Collateral murder video, the video we've just watched, it's still shocking, it's still barbaric, and it still raises the question, who did this, with whose money, and on whose authority? And that question couldn't be asked unless that film were in the public domain. It would be simply an unknown, unrecorded, and those people unmourned by anybody else but their families if that piece of information weren't in the public domain. And that's what Julian Assange and Wikileaks did, not just with this film, but over and over and over again with pieces of vital information which the public is entitled to know about, entitled to discuss, and entitled to hold their governments to account about. And that really is the importance of this case. I think that this case, the Julian Assange case, is the freedom of press case for this century. And I think that the decisions that are handed down by the courts will have an effect not just on Julian Assange's future, but on the future of a free press and on the work of every journalist. So we've got three people here who know more about this case than anybody else but Julian Assange himself. Maybe Stella knows more about it than Julian Assange knows about it. But there's a lot of history here. This is a story which goes back more than a decade. But I think it would be a mistake if we didn't first discuss what's happening now, immediately, in this country, in this country's courts, at what stage we've arrived at in the United States attempt to extradite Julian Assange to face charges under the Espionage Act in the United States. This would be the first time that any journalist has been tried under the Espionage Act. It follows from Mike Pompeo, then director of the CIA, his designation of Wikileaks as a hostile non-state intelligence agency. In other words, to recategorize the business of journalism as spying. So that's what the extradition case is about, the attempt to get Julian Assange to the United States and try him under that act. But to give you some more detail about exactly where we are and exactly what's at stake now in the courts, I'm going to ask Stella Morris to talk to you. She's Julian Assange's fiancée. She's also been a member of the legal team for Julian Assange for an extremely long time. She's a graduate of SOAS and attained master's degrees in both Oxford and Madrid. So there are a few people better qualified to let you know what's going on. Stella.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I've been sitting where you are sitting for many hours, and I did not predict I'd be on this side of the stage. I'm very pleased to be here at SOAS because SOAS equipped me with the critical understanding of power, of international relations, of the interconnectedness of the political and the legal on the international stage. And this is what is playing out so obviously in this case. The first thing I think you should know is that whatever you think of Julian, is guaranteed to be incorrect. And I'll tell you why. There has been a deliberate, orchestrated information war around Julian and Wikileaks. This is not just something I am positing there. There is a report which you should all read, a 7,500-word investigative report, 3 national security reporters, American, which was published in September last year, which laid out the CIA's attack plan against WikiLeaks. And this attack plan included the presentation of what they called sketches and options for executing Julian in London, killing him, kidnapping him, renditioning him, but also a large-scale disinformation campaign which was carried out. And there are many stories which were planted. This investigation spoke to over 30 US officials, named and unnamed, including very senior people in the CIA and the National Security Council, which confirmed that Julian's assassination was discussed at the highest levels of the Trump administration in the White House, that Mike Pompeo personally was ordering plans to assassinate Julian. Our 6-month-old baby was targeted for his DNA. Julian's lawyers' meetings with him were spied on. And when I say spied on, it's not just incidentally there was a camera in the room. There were microphones stuck on the fire extinguishers and audio recordings extracted every 12 hours and then physically transported to the United States. Julian's entire legal correspondence with his lawyers that he had had for since he got to the UK, 9 years worth of privileged, protected, confidential information was stolen and shipped off, stolen from Julian, should be protected. It's his legal advice, was shipped to the United States as well. There are so many aspects to this case, not just the fact that Julian is being prosecuted for publishing evidence of war crimes. What you just saw was a war crime. Those people were Good Samaritans who were rescuing a dying man. That man in the van was taking his children to school, and he stopped his van because he saw a man was dying on the curb, and then they killed him. That is a war crime. And the people who were flying that helicopter and who were shooting, the US military knows who they are. In fact, we could probably find out who they are. That's not a secret. There's a deliberate decision to cover up that war crime. Julian is in prison because the US is covering up its war crimes, because it's not prosecuting its own war criminals, and that goes up to the highest level of government. Julian exposed the Iraq War, he exposed the Afghan War, he exposed torture and rendition, including the complicity of European countries in that torture and rendition. And what we are seeing here is a political persecution of a publisher for publishing the truth, and the courts are being instrumentalized to persecute a journalist. I say a journalist, he is a journalist. He has been a journalist since 2007 at least. He holds journalist union credentials, he publishes articles, he does interviews. He is a journalist. A journalist is jailed, is imprisoned in the United Kingdom, a few miles from where we're sitting right now, because he published the truth exposing a superpower that was killing innocent civilians. This is what it's about.
Thanks very much, Dan. Thanks very much. Now I'm going to ask Dr. Deepa Govindarajan Driver. That's the first time I've ever done that. He's a trade unionist. He's a member of the National Executive Committee of the University College Union. She's a member of the Executive Committee of the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers, and she's a legal observer in the Julian Assange case, and she has been a fearless and consistent campaigner throughout the campaign. She's provided for ICOP a summary of the case, which you might want to have a look at. It's extremely difficult to reduce the complexity of the Julian Assange case to a single side of A4, so it's a considerable journalist coup that she's managed to do that. And so she's well placed to give us her overview of what's at stake immediately in the case now. Deepa.
Thanks, John. It's Govinda Rajan, 2 halves. It's a pleasure to be here at SOAS. The last time I was here, I was at SOAS UCU, and we were trying to work out what we could do to get people on the picket line. So it's quite nice to be on stage and actually talk to students and colleagues. It is, however, quite depressing that we're here to talk about the case of one of the world's leading journalists and one of the most intelligent and capable people who allowed us to see what our governments are doing in our name and with our money. And it is for that reason that I have, over the last few years, taken very seriously my commitment to helping ensure that Julian is free. Because it is not Julian who is on trial in the UK or just being extradited to the US, it is democracy itself. A few years ago, quite a few years ago, a German citizen by the name of Khalid El-Masri was on holiday on the Macedonian border when he was abducted by 8 CIA agents. After his abduction, he was sodomized, he was tortured, he was brutally beaten. This torture continued for several months, even though they had realized by this time that Mr. El-Masri was not the person they intended to indict. Not that it would be acceptable to do it to anybody. After they continued to brutalize Mr. El-Masri on the pretext that, well, he must be bad, they then released him on the Albanian border. He thought he was going, in the middle of the night, he thought he was going to be shot in the back of the head. He was then picked up by 2 Albanian policemen and sent back to Germany, where nobody believed his story. Nobody could believe that this man had been taken to Afghanistan, tortured, brutalized, whatever else. And you can imagine what the effect on Mr. El-Masri himself was, and the effect of being an innocent person and having your life kind of taken away in this way. His family had already left Germany thinking he had abandoned them. And as he tried to rebuild his life, the United States put pressure on the German government not to allow the case to be taken to its logical conclusion, not to allow for the CIA agents who were involved to be taken to task. It was only through Wikileaks releases that Mr. El-Masri got a small amount of justice at the European courts. And had it not been for Wikileaks releases, many people, including the 789 men who were Muslim men, I must be very clear about that, this was an Islamophobic act, the 789 Muslim men who were held at Guantanamo and brutalized and tortured, none of their stories would have been known to us. we would not have known that Guantanamo was a site of extensive waterboarding, sexual humiliation, beatings, torture, extreme sensory deprivation, where extremes of, not only there was extreme sensory deprivation, there were also extremes of heat and cold applied on people. Boys as young as 14 were held at Guantanamo. And this year, about a week and a half ago, we commemorated 20 years of Guantanamo, and 39 men are still at Guantanamo, 20 years after it was open. Were it not for journalists like Julian Assange and publishers who choose to speak the truth, despite knowing the cost it is to themselves, we cannot live in a reasonable world. It could happen to your brother, your sister, your son. It could happen to any one of us. And Julian's revelations weren't just about war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, about torture and brutalization at Guantanamo and the various CIA black sites. They were also about things like toxic waste dumping by Trafigura off the Ivory Coast, about the stuff that happened in terms of corruption in Kenya. So all over the world, ordinary people have learned various things through WikiLeaks. And WikiLeaks was important because WikiLeaks was the first organization to use what we now take for granted, a secure drop facility. Now, most journalistic publishing organizations and a number of whistleblowing organizations use that technology. WikiLeaks was also a pioneer in being able to bring together, to ensure the security of documentation as well as the security of whistleblowers. That is, that they had, one of the smears that is used against WikiLeaks time and again is that they dumped data. In fact, it is quite the opposite. A number of highly trained experts worked with WikiLeaks to ensure the information that has come to you is accurate. And you know this is the case, and that's true, because WikiLeaks, to this day, has a 100% record of accuracy, something that The Guardian or the New York Times or the Washington Post cannot claim. WikiLeaks was also able to put people in touch with local journalists, for example, in Tunisia, helping spark the Arab Spring, as well as international journalists such as The Guardian or the New York Times or the Washington Post, who were interested in the bigger stories and who would only devote column inches for a day or two. Whereas, local issues were never picked up. And so it was really important. And you can think about the courage it takes to do this, because it's not just about technical competence and intelligence and the ability to sift through this. But when the world's most powerful nation chooses to ask you to shut down any disclosure of its crimes, and it does so hand in hand with its NATO allies, including Sweden, Britain, Australia, and others and other allies, and it does so in order to hide criminality, then it takes a certain amount of courage for all those highly intelligent, highly capable people to stand up and say, no, we won't. We deserve to know the truth. And WikiLeaks spoke not for the powerful, not for the rich. They didn't do it for money. They didn't do it for prestige. They did it so that ordinary people living ordinary lives, whose lives were completely unremarkable, so to speak, could have justice when they were brutalized, tortured, raped, murdered. And so it is really important that when they showed that courage, we show the courage to stand with them, because courage, as Julian said, is contagious. And it is through his courage that a number of us today choose to stand here and say, we stand with WikiLeaks, we stand with Julian. And I'm glad to be here to show some measure of solidarity in a practical way. And I'm glad to be at the courts as a legal observer, thanks to the Haldane Society, on whose behalf I don't speak today, but who helped me to participate in these conversations. And I'm grateful to Alison for helping organize this, and to Nina, who's been wonderful. And that brief that John talked about, it was thanks to Nina that it's gone down to one page. So I owe her and her colleagues a lot of gratitude. Thank you.
Deepa, thanks very much. And the final person to contribute from the stage at the beginning of the meeting is Tim Dawson. He's representing the National Union of Journalists. He's chair of the International Federation of Journalists Expert Group on Surveillance, and he's the former president of the NUJ, an author of several books, and he's written for most of the major UK news publications. And Tim, can you give us some idea of what this would mean for journalists as a whole and for a free press if this extradition were to go ahead?
I'll try my hardest, John. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. The issue, I think, for journalists with this case is in the detail of the charges on which Julian Assange is sought. So it was very obvious that the Americans were, in a general sense, very angry with him, but they had to do a lot of thinking and kind of grinding of their legal brains to try and find a way that they might pursue him. It's reasonably well known that the Obama administration tried very hard and eventually concluded that there was no way to do it. But Mike Pompeo, when he became Secretary of State, was absolutely determined that charges should be brought. And so the device that they deployed to do this was principally the Espionage Act. Now, this is an act that was passed in 1917, I think, in a moment when, like many countries, America seemed in a sort of quasi-revolutionary ferment. If you think about the things that John Steinbeck talks about in his novels, the sort of extraordinary, very violent industrial scenes and opposition to the First World War, Woodrow Wilson was determined to clamp down on these, and he pushed through Congress what many consider to be among the most draconian pieces of legislation that's ever been passed in the United States. And it's an interesting piece of legislation because its name, or the name by which it's known, the Espionage Act, is in fact a complete misnomer. The vast majority of the convictions that have been obtained under the Espionage Act have been of trades union leaders, of political leaders, of working class leaders. I mean, thousands and thousands of people who've sought to organise ordinary and working people, and actually very, very few spies of the kind that you might imagine would be prosecuted under something called the Espionage Act. And they looked at the process by which the information, particularly in the two war log publications, had been obtained. Now, there is some dispute about this, and much of the extradition hearings was concerned with trying to resolve some of these disputes, which I'm not entirely sure that it did satisfactorily. But the suggestion is that over a period of time, Julian Assange cultivated Chelsea Manning, cultivated a source within the US military, encouraging her to seek out pieces of information that were potentially of interest and advising her on ways that that information might be taken off US servers and passed to Wikileaks in a discreet way. Now, the reason why this is of real concern is that process of seeking out a confidential source who believes that they have seen grotesque crimes committed by the organisation for which they're working and wishes to bring those to light, is a process that journalists the world over engage in. The seeking of confidential sources, the cultivating of confidential sources, the advising confidential sources of how they can pass information discreetly is the very stuff of journalism. So if Julian Assange is convicted of these crimes, then it will create a precedent that the United States could use whenever it spied a journalist who had revealed things that they found inconvenient or embarrassing. And, I mean, looking at the use of the Espionage Act over the sort of century, slightly more than a century, it's been on the statutes books, what's very clear is that it's not universally applied. They don't pursue everybody who potentially there might be a successful prosecution against, but they use it against people who've annoyed them. They use it as a kind of selective cosh to try and beat dissidents and those who show up inconvenient information. And that's, I mean, so it's that possibility that it creates. It's the possibility that it would create to target journalists anywhere in the world and then as we again heard at great length through the extradition hearings, then potentially send them to prison for the rest of their lives in circumstances which would, to be honest, embarrass a medieval despot, that the effect of that on journalism the world over would be deeply, deeply troubling. Because even if there aren't any more Julian Assanges, even if nobody does anything that will scare and rattle an American administration quite so much again, hundreds of journalists, thousands of journalists, considering national security information that they might have been passed and thinking, might this make a story? Is this something the public should know about? Can't help but have in the back of their minds, or if I publish this, might I go to prison in medieval circumstances for the rest of my life? And it is impossible to imagine that with such a potential threat, some people won't choose not to proceed with stories. Some people will say, you know what, keep your security documents, keep your evidence of war crimes, keep your evidence of corruption within government, because it's too hot to touch. I don't want to find myself suffering that kind of judicial jeopardy. Just, I mean, sort of taking a step back and kind of looking at where the case is at now and what the opportunities are, if that would be of interest. I mean, clearly, the last two appearances in court felt like bad news. They were not as supporters of the campaign would have wished to go. But in lots of other ways, I think there are things to be optimistic about. Broadly speaking, at least in its published content, the press has come behind the sentiment that this would be a deeply, deeply dangerous move and are opposing it. The story, the Yahoo story that Stella mentioned, I mean, actually, I think is extraordinary. 30 former CIA staffers explained to journalists how they'd had these secret plans to kill, kidnap, render Julian Assange. And it's worth thinking through, these are people who've had careers in the CIA. So these are not placard-waving leftists. These are people who have, been at Langley, done the training, who might reasonably be scared when Mike Pompeo says they need to be hunted down and sent to prison. But so concerned were those people, so disturbed by what they'd seen, that they spoke to a journalist to say, I've seen that and it was not right. Now, when a group of people, when 30 people with that background feel that something is so wrong that they want to speak to a journalist, that makes me think there's a lot of opinion in America that's beginning to turn and think, actually, this was a crazy course that Mike Pompeo set us off on, and it's something that we need to find a way to stop, whether it's now, whether it's at the extradition stage, or whether it gets, when it gets to the United States. Lots of people, Alan Rusbridger at The Guardian, who, at one point in this saga, clearly decided that he wasn't happy with what WikiLeaks had done, and has now completely recanted. Now says, I formed a wrong impression at that point. This is a monstrous situation that we find ourselves in, and all right-thinking people should oppose the extradition and should oppose the prosecution if it gets to that. Bodies in civic society like trades unions, political parties apart from the governing party, I think are broadly of one mind that this is a monstrous prospect and one that should be opposed. The one area that it seems to me hasn't yet turned or remains, a job of work to do, and again, I think this is something that people can really actively contribute to. If you look at opinion polls of what the public think, the most recent one I've seen is 2019, I think. Broadly speaking, 20% of the population think that Julian Assange is a traitor to the West. 20% thinks that he is a free speech hero who should be defended at all cost, and 60% either don't really have an opinion or have an opinion that doesn't correspond to one of those two. So it seems to me there's a great mass of people out there who, for one reason or another, are not engaged by this, don't think that it's important, don't think that it's something that they should be concerning themselves with. And I think taking the important message of this campaign to them is really the task that we have in hand at the moment. And actually, the flux that we find ourselves in at the moment, where we have a government and a prime minister who are behaving well, to be perfectly honest, my teenage children would be embarrassed at the way they keep coming up with explanations for this. No, it wasn't a party. No, there wasn't a suitcase of booze. No, there weren't people sleeping behind the furniture. I mean, it beggars belief. But what is their response? Their response is shoot the messenger. Their response is defund the BBC. So this shoot the messenger instinct, which is exactly, I mean, that's why Julian Assange is in this position. That's why he's in Belmarsh, because the bearer of bad news they want to shoot. That's exactly what the government are doing now. And I think, at a point where this is massively in the people's imagination, we can say, these are people who would shoot the messenger. I mean, Boris, don't forget, actually, when his friend rang him up and said, a journalist's annoying me, how can we have him beaten up? Boris actually gave actual advice on how that might be done. So these are people for whom shooting the messenger runs through their DNA, and that's what we need to expose and say. And top of the list, if messengers are to be saved, is ensuring that Julian Assange isn't extradited, isn't prosecuted, and is allowed to go free.
Tim, thanks very much for that. Now, there's an enormous, as I said at the beginning, there's an enormous history and an enormous amount of detail in the case, and I want to try and get our panellists to give you some sense of what some of the more important issues are. And I want to start, Stella, by asking you about the extradition treaty, the treaty which is being used by the United States to extradite Julian from Britain. And now most treaties, including extradition treaties and including this one, have a clause which says that you can't be extradited for your political opinions. Because if extradition treaties had that clause, then any state, no matter how authoritarian or undemocratic in the world, could point to an individual in another country and say, we don't like their political opinions, extradite them to us. So in order to prevent that, there's a political clause which says that people shouldn't be extradited for that reason. Now, Julian's lawyers attempted to make this argument in the original magistrates' court hearing. Why doesn't it seem to work in this case?
Well, I could probably take an hour. But basically, the US-UK extradition treaty is an atrocious treaty. It was, it got agreed in the immediate aftermath of the 2001 September 11th attacks. And like everything around that time, it basically fast-tracked extraditions, removed safeguards, and we're stuck with those terrible pieces of legislation now. In brief, what the UK court decided was that the treaty was not enforceable because it hadn't been, because the prohibition for political offences hadn't been introduced in the Extradition Act. And if the case goes to appeal on these other issues, this will be argued on appeal. It's clear that prosecuting someone for their publications, for publications that were clearly of a political nature, there's just no question that there isn't a political dimension, and in fact, the political aspect permeates this entire case in every little aspect. It's a hugely controversial judgment, both at the magistrates' court level and the High Court. And in fact, when the US initially issued its indictment, there were all these legal pundits saying, well, this is just a sign of how the US doesn't really want Assange extradited, because how could the UK courts ever go along with this? Well, those pundits were perhaps not familiar enough with the US-UK extradition treaty and how subservient UK courts are and the UK state is when it comes to US extraditions.
Thanks very much. Tim.
I'm not a lawyer. I have no legal training whatsoever beyond that which is required to work as a journalist. And I mean, the really intriguing thing to me about this is that the extradition treaty itself, as people will say, you know, on the street and in speech, you know, on the front page of it in plain English, there's no Latin and nothing like that. It says you can't be extradited for political reasons. And you'd think, as a citizen, well, that's pretty straightforward. My government's reached that agreement. That's what's going to apply to me. What the American lawyers argued was that a right can't be created by a treaty between governments, and that a right could only be created by the Parliament. So Parliament would have to vote to adopt that treaty for that to become a right. Now, I have no idea whether that's true in law, and Stella, it sounds to me, disputes that. But if it is true, it's impossible to ignore the fact that the government created a deceit on the people in signing that. It signed a document which purported to explain to us what our rights are, but which in effect, when tested, turns out to be complete hogwash. Or that's what the American lawyers argue. And it's like, if you had an insurance document that contained a similar deceit, it would be thrown out by the courts. If you had if you had a tenancy agreement which said you can occupy the bedrooms of the flat, but when it came down to it, it turned out that actually you couldn't, you know, that would be thrown out by the courts. Whereas here, the courts have upheld, at least so far, what seems to be something which is fundamentally dishonest, which I can only guess the government, when they signed the treaty, knew fully well was fundamentally dishonest and was likely to completely mislead people who'd look at that treaty and take some reassurance from what it appeared to guarantee them.
Sorry, just to add, the fact the Extradition Act does not include a bar to extradition for political offences doesn't just affect Julian or US extraditions. The problem with Julian's case, it's so outrageous, and the UK courts are going along with it, and it's creating a precedent that will be used in other extradition cases with other dissidents, with other journalists. Other countries are watching what is happening in the UK courts, and they will take advantage of the injustice that is playing out.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Stella. Deepa, you can't look into the Julian Assange case for very long without running up against the years that he spent inside the Ecuadorian embassy, not least because they're pretty much the only film that the major news organisations run of him. Now, in one sense, that's a kind of past story, because while he was seeking asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy, there was some debate about whether the reason that he gave for being there, i.e. that he wanted to avoid extradition through Sweden to the United States, whether or not that was true. I mean, that debate's now been settled. What he said was that the US are trying to extradite me to prosecute me under spying legislation, and that is indeed what's happened. But, I mean, there are still questions that people ask. What was he inside the Ecuadorian embassy for, and how strong was the case then against avoiding extradition to the United States for this trial?
Thanks, John. And one of the things that, you know, is amongst the fundamentals of any kind of treatment of refugees or asylum seekers is that you don't return them to places where they might be killed or harmed. And in Julian's case, this is something people seem to fail to recognize. When he was in the Ecuadorian embassy, he was there seeking asylum because he knew that his life was under serious threat. And as John explained, that's been proved time and again now. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention explored both Sweden and Britain's position and Ecuador's position in terms of their stupid comment, I would say, which says that, oh yeah, he can leave the embassy anytime he likes. If the choice is between staying in the embassy and losing your life when you come outside, the choice is very clear. The other thing that people talk about in relation to Sweden, and I speak myself as a survivor of rape, is the false allegations that were used to weaponize sexual assault in order to hide the rapes, the murders, the torture in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. And while none of us, and I feel quite awkward talking about this with Stella here, none of us will actually know what happened in the room between Julian and those women. What we have to know is that there were serious failings in the way in which Sweden investigated the case. This has been documented in a 50-point letter written by the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, and in his current book, which comes out in February, which has already come out in Swedish and German. And in all of these, he documents very clearly things like changing the witness testimony of the women, altering, procedures which should be carried out in order to allow it to hold a case in limbo for up to 7 years in order to prevent exculpatory evidence from being visible, is criminal in itself. And the British CPS has been involved in this criminality. Keir Starmer's CPS has been involved in this criminality because it was the CPS that wrote to Sweden when they wanted to drop the case. There were never any charges, of course, because it was in preliminary investigation stage, saying, don't you dare get cold feet. This case is not being treated like any other extradition. That shows you what they were concerned about. They were concerned about making sure, and you can see in the timing of when the allegations related to Sweden were suddenly swept under the carpet. When Julian's in Belmarsh, they had every opportunity to interview him, right? What's going on there? And so this is about using anything that can come to hand to prevent the exposure of the realities, the murders, the Garani massacre, the Collateral murder video, the rape, murder, torture in Iraq and Afghanistan. And if we care, as many of us do in this room and online, about Black Lives Matter, we've got to care about the lives of black and brown people in other parts of the world who've been destroyed by powerful nations like Sweden who wants to prolong the war in Afghanistan in order to sell Gripen fighter jets. So, I don't know if that answers.
Thanks very much.
Can I just add, it is the US position that Julian was inside the Ecuadorian embassy to avoid extradition to the United States. That is the US government position. It is the UK court's position in their judgment that Julian was in the Ecuadorian embassy in order to avoid being extradited to the United States. When Ecuador received his asylum application, it took 2 months to consider it, and it wrote a very long explanation, having explored the case about why it was granting political asylum, including under the 1951 Refugee Convention, to which this country, the UK, is a party. And they said that Julian was at risk of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. And part of the basis of that finding was that Chelsea Manning had been subjected to cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. Chelsea Manning, the source of the publications that Julian is being extradited over, who was convicted to a 35-year sentence and who was pardoned by Obama. Julian faces 175 years as the publisher, the person who received information from a source, information that was of importance to the public because it documented war crimes and torture and rendition, and it was his duty as a publisher to publish it, and he's being punished over that. The Collateral murder video that you saw, he faces 40 years in prison over. The Guantanamo Bay documents, he faces another 40 years.
Thanks. And now I'm going to open the meeting to the floor in just a second, so that you have a chance to ask some questions as well. But I just want to ask Tim Dawson to reflect on one point. Tonight has been about investigating the conditions of Julian Assange's trial and imprisonment and the United States attempt to extradite him. But so it's a kind of intensive investigation of the case. But Tim, it's not the only threat to free speech that this government's involved in. I see today that the National Union of Journalists is opening up a discussion on the Human Rights Act that the Tories want to abolish. I wonder if you could put it in that context, because I think it helps people to see what the government's at in the Julian Assange case, to see that it's at the same thing in other instances.
Well, yes, I agree. I mean, there's a whole raft of issues that have the potential to, affect free speech and the operation of a free press. There is a proposed reform of the Official Secrets Act, which they're sort of consulting on at the moment. They've been talking about this for some time. So while the draft legislation hasn't been published, the government's response to a Law Commission report which sets out what they intend to do has been published, and in that they say that they want to reframe official secrets so that journalists who receive confidential information can be treated with greater severity than people operating for hostile foreign powers. I mean, they say that in so many words, which is kind of mind-bending. The Law Commission, which are, sort of highfalutin and not especially liberal sort of legal think tank, essentially, in making their proposals, said the counterweight that ought to be brought in is to create a public interest defence in official secrets cases, so that if somebody was being prosecuted for an official secrets breach, it would be possible for them to say to the court, well, yes, I, as a Crown servant, I did indeed leak these documents, but I was doing so because I had noticed I'd realised that the government was doing something unlawful or corrupt or dishonest, so that a jury would be able to decide whether that was justified or not. And the government says, absolutely not. We can see no merit in introducing that kind of safeguard at all. The sort of astonishing announcements made over the last few days in respect of funding the BBC. I appreciate there may be people in the audience who don't necessarily see the BBC as a paragon of journalistic virtue. However, remove its funding and turn it into something akin to Netflix, and you will find the amount of reporting coming out of the United Kingdom reduced, I would suggest, to a tenth, the amount of broadcast reporting to a tenth of what there is at the moment. These things aren't, they don't happen by chance. They don't happen because these things float into their mind by chance. I think that there is a systematic and deliberate desire on the part of this government to, little by little, nip by nip by nip, restrict the freedom of actually all of us to express ourselves and all of us to understand the society in which we live. And unless people like all of us stand up and say we won't stand for this, I'm afraid they'll get away with it.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, well, let's take some questions from the floor. Just raise your hands and do please be concise. If you can reduce your question to one sentence, that will mean that we get more of you in. It'll also mean that you get to finish your sentence, because otherwise I'll cut you off. We'll see. and then I'll bring the speakers back. Yep, there.
In conversation just several years ago with people who were rather more involved in journalism than I am, and they said to me then, this is several years ago, they'd heard on the grapevine that privatized. Now we know. Thank you. Thank you.
Some questions that have come in from people who are watching online. So Nina, if you want to bring those in, then I'll come along the panel.
Okay, so we've got a question from Maliva. How often or not has the Australian government been in favour of Julian? How strong is the campaign for Julian in Australia?
Okay. So, Stella, do you want to talk about that actually? Because I know that you're on top of that.
Well, in terms of Julian's kidnapping, basically from the Ecuadorian embassy, Julian had been granted political asylum, including under the 1951 Refugee Convention. The threat was clearly present, the threat of extradition to the United States, where he faces 175 years, torturing, ill treatment, and so on. Ecuador changed government in 2017. The new government became close to the United States and started granting all sorts of concessions, including providing the US military with an airstrip in the Galapagos Islands. They sold out, basically. They received $4 billion IMF loan and another $6 billion loan, so basically secured a $10 billion US dollar injection in exchange for Julian's arrest. Lenin Moreno was the president, and he basically facilitated Julian's not only arrest but denigration over a long period of time. Julian was gagged from March 2018. He wasn't allowed to say anything under threat of expulsion. So they held this expulsion over Julian's head and created a climate of terror inside the embassy, which I also experienced. The UK police can be invited into any embassy if the mission invites them in. They didn't, they didn't violate any law by going into the embassy. Interestingly, Ecuador denied that Julian had been arrested inside the embassy. They said that the UK police waited outside the embassy, and Julian was walked out voluntarily or something like that. They wrestled him down to the floor. They refused him to be able to take any of his belongings, which of course were shipped off to the United States, including all his legal correspondence. But what happened there was the refoulement of a political refugee. The prohibition against refoulement is absolute. It is one of the strongest protections of international law. You cannot hand over a person to a real risk of torture or them being killed. And that is what happened. So in the bigger sense, the UK authorities are complicit in Julian's political persecution. There was a lead up to his arrest, of course, in which Ecuador, the United States, and the UK authorities were all behind the scenes planning it out. In relation to Australia, should I just... the Australian government has completely abandoned Julian, and in order to understand this, you have to understand what the 5 Eyes are. How many people know what the 5 Eyes are here? Okay, so the 5 Eyes are the security alliance between the UK, the US, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And it is more important for you to understand than NATO. If you look at the International Convention Against Enforced Disappearances, for example, it's very interesting to see how these 5 Eyes states align in not signing up to something like that. It's a security arrangement in which Australia basically has a complete alignment to the United States. And it is so far gone that the Australian High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, who sits in the Australia House right next to the Royal Courts of Justice, wears CIA cufflinks. It's not just a rumor. There are pictures. Look it up on Google. He goes to the Australian Parliament when he was Attorney General, wearing CIA cufflinks, and as the High Commissioner, which is the equivalent of ambassador, what the Australian ambassador is called in the United Kingdom is High Commissioner, wears CIA cufflinks. This is the agency that plotted to kill Julian. What can we expect? They have done nothing. Take, for example, the Mexican president, who just a few weeks ago reiterated his, not only his willingness to grant Julian political asylum, but also had written to Trump and again reiterated to Biden to pardon Julian, to leave this case, to stop this case. He did it privately to Trump and he did it publicly to Biden. That is what a political intervention is. That is what it would take for Australia to do, but they haven't done anything. They haven't asked the Biden administration to drop this case, which is the obvious step because Julian is an Australian citizen. He's not a US citizen. He's Australian. He was not in the United States when he published this. He has nothing to do with the United States. He doesn't have an oath of allegiance to the United States, just like no British journalist should have to keep the crimes of the United States or any other country, including this one, secret.
Thanks very much. It's all been there, yeah. Yes, you can, in the mask, yeah.
I'm a journalist from India, and I'm currently doing my PhD at SOAS. And one of the questions I had is when the Wikileaks, the leaks came out, a lot of newspapers picked up those stories. I remember Guardian ran it, The Hindu, where I used to work in India, ran stories based on it. But over a period of time, those stories sort of, they were no longer being published. And today, I see very little support for Julian in the mainstream press. The same media which published these stories, and lots of journalists got bylines for, just copy-pasting whatever WikiLeaks was releasing. Today, nobody wants to write about what's being done to Julian. And I think it's but I want to know why this is the case today. Why has this happened?
Okay, thanks very much. Anybody else got a question at the back there? I think the mic's just coming your way.
Yeah, I was just wondering how can we help Julian Assange, and how as well can we just help the freedom of speech, which I think is very important, and I think SOAS is trying to make the truth and respect the truth and everything, but how in a smaller extent can we help Julian Assange and the freedom of speech?
Okay, thanks very much. And there's a woman here, and then the guy behind you.
Well, I'd just like to say that there are a number of people here who are part of the Julian Assange Case Committee, and we regularly campaign in various ways in the city of London.
Sorry, can you just speak into the mic, please?
Sorry, I just want to say very briefly that to that question, what can you do?
There are a number of us here who are members of the Julian Assange Defence Committee, and there is a leaflet or a pamphlet that's going around. We regularly meet, we have weekly vigils, we do a great deal to try and support and free Julian Assange. So one of the things you can do is have a chat with us afterwards, and we'll talk to you about how you might get involved.
Okay, and the guy in that row just above the gangway.
Thanks. Somewhat linked to the lady's question there, but more on the political side. So you mentioned like obviously this has been happening under Conservatives here. We've mentioned Keir Starmer, Republicans, Democrats. Why do you think, or has there been any political support? And if not, why does no politician seem to want to, talk about these civil liberties? I know Jeremy's there, but well, where are the politicians basically? Thanks.
Very good to see Jeremy Corbyn here, who definitely has been campaigning over this issue. In fact, he's the only parliamentarian who managed to pin Boris Johnson, or the big dog, as he is now known, down on the Assange issue. Jeremy, do you want to say a bit about that?
Sorry, I've only just arrived, but thanks very much, John, and thank you, Stella, for what you just said, and solidarity and support for everything you're going through, because I can only imagine how tough it is for you, but there's a lot of love for you out there. I think you know that. 2 points, really, John. First of all, I did manage to pin Johnson down on this, and I got a rather surprising answer, actually, because I was assuming I would be accused, because I usually am, of either purveying a Russian or Chinese or some other plot. And none of it was true, because that's the normal reply I get. And instead, he gave actually quite interesting reply, because he had probably been thinking about it quite a lot in the context of other deportations or threatened of them, removals from this country. And he said in terms that the extradition arrangements between Britain and the USA were severely imbalanced. Severely imbalanced. A very interesting choice of words on his part, because it showed two things. One is he had actually prepared for the question, even though he couldn't possibly have known I was going to bring it up, because I certainly didn't inform him in advance. And the only people that knew I was bringing it up were those in my office, and they certainly wouldn't have told him. So it was interesting that clearly it's a thought process that's going on there. And secondly, the role of the British media in this has been nothing short of scandalous, actually. Every time I've been outside the court, and we've been there quite a few times, there's dozens of actually very mainstream journalists from all around the world there. They're not just the left journalists, they're pretty mainstream from every other country except this one. Like, it's hardly reported at all, and if it is, it's always in the context that somehow or other Julian is sort of a threat to our national security or something, or some nonsense like this. Julian actually exposed the truth about a lot of the horrible stuff that's been going on around the world. He should be a hero, and indeed in any other context around the world. So suppose Julian happened to have been born Russian than Australian, and he had done the same thing with Russian information, he'd be a hero all over the world, except probably in Russia. And so I think we should just think on that. And as to international solidarity, I was, as you probably know, John, in Mexico for a couple of weeks at the beginning, end of December, beginning of January, and Lara and I went to the President's daily press conference, which is quite a substantial affair. And he invited me to speak to the press conference about my views on economic strategies and so on, which I did. And very interestingly, he brought up the whole question of Julian Assange during his conference. And he also said, which I didn't know this before, you may have done, that he personally put a lot of pressure on Donald Trump just before Trump stepped down as president, apparently with near success. It got very close because Trump's answer was actually, again, quite nuanced. He said, well, on balance, I decided to let the legal process go ahead. And for Trump to use the word balance, I'd never heard him use it before. I'm not even sure he's aware of the word before. But so it was interesting. And President Lopez Obrador then said absolutely in terms, and I was sitting beside him when he said it, that the humanitarian door of Mexico is open for Julian Assange if ever he chooses to come. We will welcome him and give him peace and a place of safety and sanctuary in Mexico. And I think he should be thanked for that, because it does go in much of the best traditions of Mexico in granting asylum to people. And it's got many other problems, but it's done very well there. So I just think we should thank him for that. Our campaign has got to be as strong and big and wide and broad and loud and noisy as possible. And since the House of Lords have now said it's okay to have noisy demonstrations, we can go back with our bugles and continue those noisy demonstrations wherever we wish to do so. But can I say thank you very much to John and to all of you on the panel for all the fantastic work you do in supporting somebody who has made this world a safer, not a more dangerous place. Well done, Julian.
Thanks. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Jeremy. It's always a pleasure to have you here, especially actually as it turns out you're standing in for John McDonnell, who was due on this platform. I should pass on his apologies because he thought it was an online event and therefore failed to turn up at the actual auditorium with the rest of us. I'm sure that in these days that's a mistake that we could all make. But I should also commend John because he's the first and only British MP who's managed to get into Belmarsh to see Julian Assange. I went in with him. It took us literally months to gain access for a British Member of Parliament to see somebody requesting to see him as a prisoner in a British prison. Yeah, indeed. And the prison authorities turned it down. The prison authorities said he couldn't come as an official representative. He had to come on a social visit as a friend or relative. So, in effect, the prison authorities denied the official standing of the representative of the Labour Party and a sitting MP at that time. Usually John McDonnell and I race to make the joke that we're the only people who've actually broken in to Belmarsh, but that's exactly how hard it is in this case. None of the normal rules apply. Stella, were you going to say?
Yeah, I think it would be wrong to assume that we're up against a solid wall. This case is enormously controversial, not only because of the obvious reasons that Julian is currently imprisoned, almost 3 years in prison without being sentenced to anything, facing 175 years for publishing evidence of war crimes. Not just because of that, but because this case in itself corrupts the institutions that are engaging in it. It is an exponent of the debasement of international law, of the safeguards that we had and lost after 9/11, and the solidification of that impoverishment. And not only that, when Julian first published these publications in 2010, we had stronger rights than we have now. States are far more powerful than they were 10 years ago. There's a consolidation of power and of those in power to further encroach on our rights. And Julian's persecution and prosecution is a pivotal moment in that process. This is not just the free press case of the century, it is much more than that. There are all our rights are attached to the ability of the press to publish freely, of free speech, of the ability to publish the truth without being punished over it. And I really think that Julian, I think historically, you take a kind of zoom out, when an important case is underway, sometimes it is difficult to understand its historical importance. Julian's case is like the Dreyfus affair. But the Dreyfus affair took, I think, a decade. It developed over a long period of time. By the end of it, everyone was on the same page. But I think it's a lot like that. And Julian is seen over the world as basically a modern-day Solzhenitsyn. This case is incredibly significant. The ramifications are enormous, not just for the US Espionage Act, but for democracy here.
Thanks, Stella. Now, I know we've got one more question that's come in online, so let's just take that, and then I'll come back to our panelists to sum up their thoughts on the discussion.
Yeah, John, somebody wants to know, is there a practical difference between a Republican or Democrat in the White House? And how would that affect extradition attempts? And if Julian were to be extradited, could we expect a transparent trial, or would it be held behind closed doors?
Okay, thanks very much. Now, in terms of responding to the whole discussion and indeed to those questions, I'm going to give our panelists the last chance to sum up the meeting. So if we could start with Deepa, and then we'll move along.
Thanks, John. I wanted to pick up on a couple of questions earlier. One about the Ecuadorian embassy and whether that extraction was legal, and also about Julian's treatment, but also to pick up on a broader point that I'll make. The first is that when Julian was in Wandsworth prison, he broke a tooth because of an unidentified hard object in his food. While he was in the Ecuadorian embassy, Julian needed to have root canal treatment. And you can imagine what it's like to have a broken tooth and a broken root and pain. And Julian was not allowed to come out of the embassy to have medical treatment for the tooth, despite that and another shoulder injury for which the Ecuadorian consul asked permission for him to be taken to a medical facility where they needed an MRI, etc., etc. So that is symbolic of the torture that Julian has experienced. It is also part of the same process where somebody else asked about the treatment in relation to Australia. And Australia wants to treat him like as somebody said, like a backpacker in Bali who needs consular assistance, rather than understand and recognize and deal with things with the gravitas of the case as it is now. But people like Andrew Wilkie and Australia's Deputy Premier George Christensen have come out publicly in support of Julian, and the tide is turning in that sense. And we have to recognize that the work of the Committee to Defend Julian Assange, John's Don't Extradite Assange official campaign, campaigners all over the world, is making a difference. But that difference can only, there is the build-up now to a critical mass where we have the People's Prime Minister who is on our side. And so we need to use that to make sure that the torture at Guantanamo was illegal and cannot be made legal. The torture of Julian Assange is illegal and continues, and it's continuing in Belmarsh every day. It's continuing with us, for me as a legal observer, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the Holiday Inn, but this is just a statement of fact. It was difficult as a legal observer to get into the Old Bailey I was forced to queue at 3 and 4 in the morning with the help of some of colleagues here who allowed me to go and have a restroom break in order to be able to get into the building. Australia was reserved 3 seats out of the 5 seats available in the public gallery. For the first part of the day, we weren't even allowed in. Those seats were never used through the extradition hearings in September. All through the case, there is clear evidence of judicial bias, whether it is Judge Snow coming out and saying, Julian says not guilty, and he says you're an narcissist, or whether it is judges with serious conflicts of interest like Lady Emma Arbuthnot, whose husband has dealings with MI6 and MI5, and whose son has holdings in deep dark trace, which works against organizations like WikiLeaks, and who herself has received hospitality from the FCO. And this is not information that I'm uncovering, it's in the public domain through organizations like Declassified UK. Lots of evidence is emerging of judicial processes not being respected, whether it is the CPS under Keir Starmer trying to keep the case in limbo, whether it is the judicial process at the moment, which fails to respect even basic rights, where Julian, on the first night of his hearings, is moved from cell to cell 5 times, handcuffed 11 times, strip searched twice, has his privileged papers taken away from him. This is not being treated like the ordinary process of law. And the use of the Extradition Act is very distressing, because it is very similar to Guantanamo, where you place people outside the scope of the law. Because here, what you're doing with the Extradition Act is you don't have to have beyond reasonable doubt or on the balance of probabilities that this person is guilty. There is a presumption in favor of extradition, and everybody's arguing against the extradition. And so you're starting from a point where your rights are already almost deprived from you. And everybody's pretending like this is a normal case going on in Britain. The coverage in the media always seems to include smears. That's changing. But what needs to change is some scrutiny and some attention to the way in which we are treated as citizens when we want to observe the courts, the way in which the courts themselves behave, the judges, the prosecutors behave in court, in upholding the rule of law, and in recognizing that we have a right under a democracy for us to understand the crimes the governments commit in our name. And that has to be at the heart of this. What we have to focus on in our discussions has to be about what WikiLeaks did. The fantastic revelations like the Collateral murder video, like the hidden torture and sadism and Islamophobic behavior in Guantanamo, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in the war on terror. And we need to focus on that and talk to more people about that, because when I talk to people about those things, they recognize that what is happening is Julian is being stitched up, and that needs to stop.
Deepa, thanks very much. Tim.
I'll try and be quick and expand slightly on something that Deepa said. I'm willing to believe that if we worked it a little bit in this room, we could probably find some differences of opinion about how we should proceed in this. In fact, I wouldn't be at all surprised if we couldn't work up quite a scrap among some of us with a little bit of effort. And I would encourage all of you to put all of that to one side, because there are thousands and millions of people out there who either don't know about this case or don't think that it's important, and they're the ones that we should be talking to. And we should be finding every opportunity that we can to seek out those people who either don't know about it or don't care about it, and to raise it with them. Whether we do that in trades unions or in faith groups or community groups or simply people we bump into, that's who we should be trying to talk to. And when we've talked to them about the peril of Julian Assange being extradited, we should talk about those other free expression issues, because they all circle back to the same place. They all circle back to the monstrous both the injustice that would be done, but the danger and the jeopardy that it would be created if this prosecution goes ahead. If we and others who share that take that out to the people, the unconverted, the unfamiliar, that's how we'll create change, and I would encourage all of you to do that.
Well, I encourage you all to speak to the committee to defend Julian Assange, to join the email group, the Don't Extradite Assange email list, to come to the protests, especially on the days that that there's a rally or the court dates and so on. Follow me on social media. I'm Stella Morris with 1R, numeral 1 afterwards. Follow Wikileaks and so on. In your studies, use Wikileaks material. There's a wealth of, especially if you're, politics, history, whatever, that is where the best investigations appear. Actually, there are continue to be very good investigative reporting using Wikileaks publications. There was a radio program on the BBC a couple of years ago that won all sorts of awards about the assassination of Benazir Bhutto, that sourced heavily from Wikileaks publications. There are millions of documents, original source documents, and don't treat Julian's case as a marginal issue. It is not a marginal issue. It is central. And even if the BBC isn't reporting as it should, and Channel 4, and so on, Amnesty International is unequivocal. Human Rights Watch is unequivocal. The Guardian, the Mail on Sunday. This is across politics, right and left, in terms of the print media. The Guardian, the New York Times, the Washington Post are all on the same page on this. This case is a travesty. Julian has to be freed immediately. And for those who don't take that position, what position do they actually take? If you're not for Julian's freedom, if you're not against this prosecution, what are you for?
Thanks very much. Thanks again to Alison and Nina and ICOP at SOAS for hosting this event. Thanks very much to Stella Morris, to Tim Dawson, and to Dr. Deepa Govindarajan. Shall I do this one more time? Govinda Rajan Driver. I'll just do that one more time. Govinda Rajan Driver. Just to prove that I haven't totally lost control of my ability to speak. I'd like to thank all of them very much for participation in the event. I pass on John McDonnell's apologies and thank Jeremy Corbyn for being here and supporting us. And I'll leave you with this thought. We've discussed many, many aspects of the complexities and the history of the Julian Assange case. And it's right that we should do, and to draw the connections with many other aspects of politics as they exist in this country and around the world today. But campaigning is the business of simplification. Just as Deepa managed to reduce the entire case to one side of A4, campaigners must reduce their message to a simple and clearly understood one that millions of people who have not yet made up their minds about this case can make up their minds about this case. I'm a great fan of the 17th century polymath Blaise Pascal's remark when he said to a friend, "I'm sorry to have written you such a long letter. I didn't have time to write you a short one." It takes more effort to reduce to the essential. The essential here is don't extradite Assange. Either this man goes to the United States and disappears into one of the deepest black holes that that country's legal system can create, or we stop him going to the United States and he walks free. And he will walk free if millions of people begin to amplify those voices that we've already heard. It comes down to this. Do you want the news to be simply corporate and government handouts, or do you want to hear the other side of the story? If you want to hear the other side of the story, don't extradite Assange. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you. Thanks very much, John, and thanks to our panellists, Stella, Tim, and Deepa. And thanks to you, our audience, for being with us this evening. Please come and join us again next week. We're actually going to be doing the final event on this series of journalism in the firing line. I'm going to put the details up on the projector shortly. And please register, just as you did this evening, on our Eventbrite. Thanks again and goodbye from me. I'm just going to hand you over to Alison for a few last words.
Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience, and thank you for an excellent panel. This has been a really, really powerful and important evening. I just want to close by thanking Nina particularly for being such an amazing organiser and host for this event, and Sanjana and Rana and all the rest of my team. I won't name them all, but they've all had a hand in this evening. And just to remind you what I said earlier on, which is that SOAS ICOP has got a direct line into all MPs and all members of the House of Lords. Now, it's true to say that we don't get traction from the Tories, but our stuff is read, and as you know, Deepa she managed to compress all her knowledge into a one-pager. So these one-page bulletins go out, and as I mentioned to you earlier on, we were actually mentioned in the House of Lords debate today on the policing bill. So if you want to think of another practical way forward, we could use SOAS ICOP as a platform for a continuation of this campaign. I'm not sure in what way we would do that. We could do more briefings, we could hold a professional panel and a panel of experts. There are lots of different things we could do. So bear in mind, look up SOAS ICOP and we'll see that there is work that we could do together. And it would also involve the gentleman's comment at the back about free speech, which I've been researching for years. It's really important that we try to stop the government from pretending to give us libertarian values, but actually shutting us down. So thank you for being here.